this video is not referring to the idea of fixing the French scene in all respects, or the right roster move that has to happen that would fix the whole scene. It's actually a play on the term fix, which I noticed in an interview with Existence not so long ago, after we found out that Shox was splitting with G2 and they didn't know which lineup they were going to go with. And when they asked Existence for his ultimate lineup from the French scene, he listed off himself, Smiths, Shox, who was it, Kenny S, and then as the fifth player he said NBK, and he said because he's the best fix in the French scene. Now, I don't know if that was actually just a mistranslation, like someone just took that term and meant it where they meant to say support player or someone who can fill in all the different roles. So I'm not actually sure. I'll check after this video. Maybe people can tell me in the comments if that is actually the term in the French scene for support player or for the person who can just play any role you need him to play. Because that's what I assume that term meant. And if it's actually a correct term, what a fucking great term. And if it's not the term, I'm taking it. Because I think it's a brilliant concept for someone who's not just a support player. They can't only do that. They're not just an entry player and only do that. But there's someone who's got so much talent, you can really kind of put them anywhere. I mean, think of it like the concept of being the fill in a League of Legends solo queue game, where you just go to whatever role's left over to make up a decent looking team because you can play that other role. Or in Dota, you've obviously had many players in that game who've switched roles. I mean, I think one of the best examples of someone switching roles and still being fantastic at all of them is where the Swedish player VeXii was the 4 position in Evil Geniuses that was a very good team, and then switched over to Team Secret, and he was the offlaner, and he was in role 3, and he was fucking fantastic. So in that context of having the fix, the guy who can play multiple different roles, can swap between the roles, I have to say the French scene is actually massively lacking right now. I think they really lack for that. And for me, that's actually one of the main things they lack for after a good in-game leader. And obviously they have the whole political situation with Existence, and then the way HawpT's gone off the ball and pissed everyone off. And now G2, Shox doesn't want to do it, and NBK doesn't look like he can do it. So okay, yes, in-game leader is clearly the biggest kind of gaping hole, which is dying to be patched up and to be healed and to be no longer a problem. But I also think this is one that's underrated, that people don't look at that much. And you think about how many of the last couple of years of the French scene have just been based on fragging and just been based on either Shox or Kenny S being godlike players. And you really think they do really lack for a supportive player or someone who can swap to being an entry for a certain period of time or can do all these different aspects. You might want that might be the second guy in this scene. It's kind of weird, though, because they've always had a good talent pool. They've still got a good talent pool now in France, and yet they're not getting results anywhere close to what you think of historically that they used to be able to get. I mean, this is a scene that won 2 majors. This is a scene that had won numerous other big international LAN tournaments, that has had world #1 teams, Very Games Titan, LDLC Envious after the second French Shuffle who won that other major. But the last few years have been terrible overall. They went from, in 2013, 2014, they had 3 solid level international teams, like one world class, another just behind them, like borderline elite, like the LDLC team of 2013, the LDLC team with HawpT in 2014. And then you would have one other team, which is the kind of leftovers. And even that would be like borderline top 10 level team, still a solid team. Then you go from that. We go from the major winning era to the 2016 or 2015 rather, where obviously because of Kaylee being banned, now Titan's just a solid team, but you've still got LDLC Envious. That's like a world-class team. Then you go the next year after Shox had done his coup d'etat, Envious falls off and just become a solid team. But okay, you've still got G2. They're like borderline elite, still pretty good, right? They can upset people. They won ECS, they almost won EPL, but beyond that, not a consistent elite team, not a team that was going to win a major. Still a solid team in Envious, but much worse than the past. Then you go to 2017, you have one team that's borderline elite again. You have G2 with Shox and Kenny S. They can win tournaments, but if they don't win tournaments, odds are they're not even going to finish top 4. Then you have Envious, who's average at best, but actually finishing last at a lot of tournaments. Ultimately, not really a team capable of doing anything. And now you get to now, Envious arguably even worse, G2 much, much worse, not even borderline elite, and everyone's just waiting for another shuffle, for another set of teams to be made. And we know out of the talent out there, with all these squads, with the players returning from Misfits, with the LDLC players, with the G2 lineup now, with the Envious players, there's actually more talent than ever in the French scene. But where are all the good teams? So looking at the idea of supportive elements or players who can play facilitating roles and can fill in different holes in your teams, it's actually always been a very underrated aspect in all teams, but for good reason. It's because as an outsider, if you see the fragging's low, or you see someone just does a decent job and someone plays a spot and doesn't move much and produce highlights and he just gets one kill and dies or gets traded on, but in a great way, it's actually really hard to kind of judge how much of that was him, how much was the fact he's just bad that he died, or he's doing it for his teammate, or he's baiting himself for a teammate, or he's helping out a specific teammate. It's always hard to know, and so understandably, we can't rate those guys super highly, but you'd expect the people in those teams to understand how good they are. And you look in history, practically every truly great CSGO team had people playing these kinds of roles where they had to fill in for what you needed to surround the stars and the key players. So in the early NIP, yes, you had Fiflaren, who obviously was playing this kind of a role. He was even sometimes the Phil Orper, but Exist also. This is someone who in 1.6 would be a star player on a lesser level. And now you come to an in-game leader towards the end, and then you come to CSGO, he's having to be kind of another guy who's just making up the numbers, but in a great team and was doing decent enough job early on. Then you have the Very Games team that became number one. You have Existence, the in-game leader, but putting himself in entry positions, getting wrecked. You have Smiths, who again is playing a supportive role, more of a team-based role. You have the Virtus Pro team, where Neo and Taz, the stars of 1.6, now are making themselves subservient to allow people like Snacks, Pasha, Bialy to go off. This is one of the things I know Taz always prided himself on. Neo obviously became very clutch for a supportive type player. You had the Fnatic team that was so dominant. Like, what people miss is, because Crims was such a good player, he really did play a lot of the support slots. And then the other guy, because again, this guy was a monster at majors, people don't realize when that team was at its best, when Olofmeister was the star player, when JW could do all those crazy wildcard AWP moves, when Pronax was something of a bot, but was still doing a decent job reading the game, yeah, Crims was like one element of the supportive aspect, but there's certain maps where, like I thought of Mirage, for example, where Flusher played kind of a supportive role and had to kind of be subservient and give up some of what could have been his star role if he'd been in another team. You think of the TSM Astralis core, obviously Zipnix for the whole time, and then whoever their in-game leader was pretty much always had to do a supportive role. Fetish, Karrigan, Glaive. You think of the Envious team that won the major, the first one, the LDLC team rather. This was a team where NBK had to switch to being a supportive player. Kiyoshin was forced into kind of an entry role that he didn't really want to do, but as a kind of facilitating element. You come to the Luminosity SK Gaming lineup, right? Taco, obviously, the entire time has been a pure support. And I think at times when FNX joined, he actually played a lot more supportive than people necessarily realized, anchored some of that team play. And as a result, yeah, he won some clutches and looked really cool, but that's what allowed those other players to go nuts and do whatever they wanted. And then more recent times, I would say in FaZe, in the first lineup where Karrigan had Nico, I would say he made Kiyoshima a supportive player in that team, and actually he started to excel towards the end, even though, yes, he shit the bed at that last major and was a good reason as to why he was kicked, along with some other shit behind the scenes that sadly apparently is never going to be revealed. And then you had Olofmeister in the latter day lineup where you had all these other stars, all these other guys popping off, and then Olof pretty much had to do a bit of everything, support on some maps, entry on other maps, play the shit roles on CT side, but was very good at it, and therefore enabled some semblance of team play to go along with all these amazing star players. So everyone needs these players. And yes, a lot of those players, like half and half, I'd say, were players who could have been stars elsewhere or the main best player in another team. And half of them but were able to adapt to being the supportive or fix elements. Or they're players who maybe were stars in past games but can't be stars anymore, and so have had to have that mentality shift and then made themselves very serviceable supportive elements within better teams with better stars. Then you look at the French scene for the last few years. We're talking about like 2016 onwards. So NBK, from the Envious lineup to the G2 lineup, remained a supportive element, something of a fixed element, either an entry, second entry, support player. This guy could absolutely go to another team or have a team built around him as like the second or third best player, and be a featured part of the offense, be a featured part of the focal point and the resources of a team. He plays those roles out of choice and out of necessity because he sees there aren't these players in the scene. Definitely not as skilled as him. You look at the FaZe lineup I was talking about before, Kiyoshima, Same scenario. This guy could be in another team, could be a pretty good player, but if you put him in that FaZe lineup, a much better team than he probably warrants, and then he gets on the same page as Carrigan, who brought him back from death, as it were, Lazarus style, Carrigan being the Jesus, who decided to trade the life of Jacob for Kiyashima instead. That gave Kiyashima a whole new lease on life. And during that period where they were making like whatever it was like 4 finals in a row, he was a really solid element that anchored that team, which had some star power and then had a bunch of players, and they'd never had real success for that team on that level before Nico arrived, but also before Kiyashima switched over to this role. You look at Maniac when he was down in LDLC. The LDLC team was not good, and a bunch of those players will never play at the top pro level. But how were they able to win 11 EPL games? How were they able to have the odd upset on LAN? Because they had existence, an in-game leader much overqualified for that position. They had Alex as a burgeoning player, Twanu as something of a wasted talent, and then what else did they have? They had Maniac, who at least was willing to play an entry facilitating role. Someone who's played all that, who has legendary experience. I won't say legendary. He has extensive experience. How about that? That's more fair. And again, to some degree, could have been a supportive element in a better team if politics was different and people hadn't got a certain set reputation of him. Then you look at the current Envious. I don't even know who it is in this team. I would assume they've made XMS something of a facilitating element. Meanwhile, he probably himself should be elsewhere playing as a better player, probably in the third best French team, but as the best player and breaking out, and now would have his chance to replace someone else in a big team, right? And get into Envious the normal way instead of having to play the bit trolls. Seems like there aren't really any of these players around there, right? Then you look at someone like Maniac. So this is one of the things that made me think of this video. So Maniac just retired from competitive play. I mean, I know someone could make a joke like, pretty sure he's been retired since 2015. He just wasn't aware himself. But anyway, that's just banter. Now, he is someone who will never actually get any of the credit he deserves because, yes, a lot of his career, when he played at tier 1 level, he fragged like a bot. But you know what? He was a supportive and facilitating element on some really solid teams. He was on that LDLC with Kenny S back in 2013 that almost made the final of DreamHack Summer during the NIP, the very games period when Copenhagen Wolves was getting good. Then he was on the LDLC pre-shuffle that had Happy. Now, that was a very solid team. People forget. They finished top 8 at Katowice Major. Then they were top 4 at Copenhagen Games, beating the Titan lineup, which had Shocks in it. Then they won DreamHack Valencia, which was a weird event because it didn't have like elite teams there. They were the best team there. And then also you had the Hellraisers, which was like the Dosia, a Drenga, well, it might not be a Dren at that point in time, I think Dosia, Angel, etc. And then you also had Shocks' Epsilon team. That was the one, by the way, where Shocks like 16-0'd Hellraisers, I think. And then they were finished top 4 at the major, ESL1 Cologne, almost won that tournament, almost went to the final of that tournament for my money. Albeit Apex going ham. This is when Happy was still an actual tactical in-game leader. And this is an example of a pretty good team that was peaking, and that's why the French shuffle happened in part. That coupled with Titan shit in the bed. Then he goes over to Titan, the Kaylee, Kenny S lineup. They win DreamHack Stockholm. They're making it to solid finishes at the big international tournaments. But obviously, then you come to a world where Kaylee gets banned. Now they actually become a better team, believe it or not, because Kenny S gets completely unleashed. All the resources go to him. Existence goes to the most ridiculous, like, shit role player ever. Like, just plays every bad role, entry all the time, do whatever needs to be done so that people like Kenny S hard carrying and Apex doing this and that have a chance to do it. And people forget, yes, at that point in time, Maniac wasn't that good. But when Kenny S started to drop off the boil around the spring going into the summer, actually Maniac became one of the best fraggers in the team, one of the best players in the team, and was actually then something of the connective tissue, keeping together the team while Kenny S became just a good player, while Apex had his up and down tournaments, while no longer could, as the scene got stronger and stronger during the year, could they get those top 4s as easily, or those finals as easily, and get as many upsets as they were during the period where Kenny S was going super ham. Then obviously they had the period towards the end where, yes, everything went badly. He got pretty bad towards the end. The team got pretty bad towards the end. And then obviously the second French shuffle happened. Now, this is a guy where, go beyond the fragging, he has a great attitude as a player. Definitely a very good attitude. He's someone who will be a fix, will play whatever roles you need him to play, does what is asked of him without necessarily complaining, not egotistical, demanding anything of himself or thinking he should be put ahead of other people. But this guy just could not, for love nor money, find his way into G2 or Envious these last few years. Not even Envious. I mean, basically, on Titan, yes, there was the perception that he was shit at a period of time. And quite frankly, the only reason they kept him on Titan after the Kaylee incident was because he couldn't really get anyone else. That's what people thought, at least at the time. Nobody knew back then that Body would be good if you gave him a try. Maybe he wouldn't have been a year earlier. Scream was off in Kingwin and was considered something of a failed experiment. Kaylee was banned. Foxio was banned. These are the star player elements he might have brought in. Who else was banned? Well, obviously, all the other players who played the shit roles in the French teams of the years earlier that you won't remember. People like Uzi, people like GMX. So as a result, you just weren't in a position where you could actually get anyone else they felt like, and that's the only reason he even got his latter-day chance. So to me, a flaw of the French scene in this respect is that ever since the first French shuffle, where they made that LDLC lineup, which people are going to look back now and go, that's not that crazy. At the time, that was a naughty lineup. And it actually, for my money, was a very skilled lineup. And I actually always used to say, during the era where them and Fnatic, at the end of 2014, early 2015, were vying for every title, and it looked like they were going to share an era before Fnatic just took over and blew them out the water for the last 6 months. It really looked like it was going to be a shared era, and in part because Fnatic was all the team play, with some star elements and a very solid core, but LDLC had ridiculous skill level. They were, at the time, they were arguably the most skilled team in the entire game. And they didn't have a supportive element, because guess what? Their support was NBK. It was someone who should be like a very good player or doing one of the key roles in a much better team like he had in the Titan and very game teams of the past, but demeaned himself to that level, did the facilitating supportive role, and was a much better fragger at that role than almost anyone in the scene except maybe Xyp9x. And even then, I'd argue at that point in time, actually, NBK was probably more skilled than Xyp9x, even if Xyp9x was a smarter player and better at clutches. So the problem is, they've gotten to the point where they thought they could do that with everyone. So in that LDLC team, the first one, the one after the first French shuffle, they had Shox forced into an entry role, one of the best clutch round and mid-round players of all time, NBK as your support player, and Kiyashima doing some entrying as well, and depending on who you believe, sometimes having to pick up more of the slack of that when Shox didn't necessarily want to sometimes. Now, NBK and Shox are two of the most talented winners and players in French history at that point in time. Then you go to Envious after the second French shuffle. So now you have NBK still having to be a support, and Kenny S becomes just another player and an AWPer. He's not even a central player. Again, two of the best players in French history. Then you come to G2 when they had Scream and RPK and Shox. This is where they took Body into the team after kicking existence, because Shox became the in-game leader and just did a loose style. And Body, his job was basically like, right, we've all got our roles. You just do whatever's left over. And in that year, he did an admirable job. Now, unfortunately, I think doing so made people just say, right, he's already at the status of like being able to play like a veteran against all the best teams. So then you took Shox as the in-game leader in a different style after the next French shuffle, the third French shuffle. Body wasn't a very good support at that point in time, but he was forced in that role again. Now you have NBK who can fix and be the second entry, be a supportive player. You come to Envious, and as I said, I mean, I can only even think of XMS. I don't even know if he fully qualifies. And he himself should have been elsewhere as a star on a lesser team to really prove himself and build up his career, not forced in his shit roles in a team that's got a big name, big money, but isn't doing anything and has no room for growth or development under an in-game leader who seemingly didn't know how to use him. So you think, who could you even get as these players? Right, okay, you could get Maniac as a support player. He's done it for a long time. No one wants him. You could get Smiths. No one wants him. He's only getting brought back now because he's played so long with Existence. Existence wants to play with Shox, and Shox has this never-ending love affair with Smiths. Okay, plus they know at least he's played that role a lot, so they're willing to take a chance. Beyond that, there's no one. I mean, as I said, there was some of the other names you might have considered are banned. GMX, Uzi. They're never really good players, but they at least might have had the mentality to do this, because that's one of the problems. I think that these players in France look at Kiyashima, look at NBK, and they think, right, we don't need, true fixes, true support players. You can just take a good player, whoever doesn't fit in one of the better roles, and just say, right, instead of just going to another team, play on our team as the supportive element, and, it'll all work out right. There's very few players can do that. It takes a special mentality, it takes a special skill set, it takes a special, I would say, kind of like mental strength to be able to do that as someone who could be a star or a focal featured element elsewhere in another team. It's one thing if that's your only chance in the pro scene and you make it. That's why I know that when those players, like some of the supports I've mentioned, make it to the top level, that's why I think you can rely on them and put them in those spots, because that's all they've ever done. That's the life they've lived. It's like Apex is an entry fragger. He might have his ups and downs, but this guy's committed to that role, whereas other people are good at it for a while and then they go, yeah, I do not want to do it anymore. Can you do it? Don't know why everyone's just always shocked in this scenario, but whatever. It's just the best of the accents in it. It's that and Happy. I go between the two, but there's actually almost no reason to ever talk about Happy nowadays, so just shocks it is. Now, part of the issue here is the French scene has so much talent. So if you're going to tell me they don't have players who can play these roles, I don't believe you. Because look at it, they have the star players. They have some of the best of all time. They have the semi-star players, players who are pretty good, can be an MVP of a tournament, but aren't going to be your traditional star players. Yeah, sure, they lack in-game leaders to some degree. I think it's more just a case of the wrong personnel with the wrong in-game leader. I think I could fix that overnight if you made me the GM. But most importantly, I think they have none of these fixes except NBK. That's about it. And we don't know about Kiyashima yet because he's stuck in envious prison. Now, why might this be? Well, it's all the usual reasons you'd expect from the French scene. Ego. Oh, I want to be the star. I should have le focus. Arrogance. Oh, I am better than everyone. Oh, I'm doing really well. I did well this game. You did badly. Oh, let's look at each other's scoreboard and judge each other and talk shit behind each other's backs rather than actually get a proper team balance. Poor work ethic, that's got to go in there, right? If your team that doesn't put in the hours, doesn't study the game, doesn't have these pieces that can help be the connective tissue in a real strat and employ real strats and real management of economy, so you're not just having to force buy and gamble your way with some nice aim to get back in the games, yeah, you might actually be able to be consistent. You might be able to win some fucking tournaments, which none of these teams, Envious and G2, have been for the last year and a half. There's also just too much emphasis generally on self and role. People are off thinking about their role, what they're going to do, how they're going to succeed, how they're playing individually. They don't have any guys like Taco who are just sacrificing themselves, knowing if we win this game, who gives a fuck if everyone says I'm shit and I had 0.5 FPR? I get enough this massive trophy while fucking Device and Kerrigan are crying in that corner over there. That's a pretty sick life, isn't it? As opposed to being a good player on like the third best Brazilian team or whatever the fuck his options would be. And to summarize all of this, I will just say this much. Anyone out there who criticises NBK, thinks he's overrated, thinks he's only in these teams called politics, don't get me wrong. This guy is a fucking straight up House of Cards, like multiple season appearing featured guest in terms of his ability to play the political game. But he is the key to the French scene and probably always will be because of his ability to play this role of the fix that is so missing. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset. And now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.